All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a pretty dark part of Canadian history, the Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka case.
Yeah, this is going to be a heavy one.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be a rough one for sure. We're going to try to unpack the twisted timeline of their crimes, the way the investigation was handled, and just the impact this case had on, well, everything, really.
Yeah.
We're going to be using this article from the Canadian Encyclopedia as kind of our guide.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
You know what I think is really striking about this case is just how it all played out over years and years.
Oh, for sure.
It started with this string of rapes in Scarborough,
Right.
and it just completely terrorized the community.
5 years, man. 5 years of this Scarborough rapist just preying on these young women.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the attacks themselves. I mean, that was bad enough.
Oh, absolutely.
But it was this lingering fear,
Yeah.
this constant anxiety that it could happen again to anyone.
At any time, right?
Right.
And he was so brutal, too. I mean, attacking them outdoors, beating them, threatening them into silence.
Yeah, he always seemed to be one step ahead of the police.
And there was even that incident where a police officer almost caught him in the act.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that.
But somehow he managed to get away.
It's incredible he slipped through their fingers.
I know.
That just shows you how Bernardo was really good at exploiting the limits of police investigations at the time.
Right.
I mean, think about it back then. DNA technology was brand new.
Yeah, it was in its infancy, for sure.
The Center of Forensic Sciences had this huge backlog of samples,
Oh, yeah.
and it took them forever to process anything.
So even if they had gotten his DNA early on,
Right.
it could have been sitting in a lab somewhere just waiting.
Exactly. And who knows how many attacks could have been prevented if that technology had been more advanced.
It's just chilling to think about.
Absolutely. Those delays had really, really serious consequences.
But then there's this whole other layer to this whole thing, right? The death of Tammy Homolka.
Karla's younger sister.
Right.
At first, it just looked like a really tragic accident.
But there were just some strange details that didn't add up.
A lot of things just didn't sit right.
That burn mark on her face that they thought was from the carpet?
Yeah.
Come on, that seems like a pretty obvious red flag.
Well, at the time, the official explanation was that she choked on her own vomit after drinking.
Okay.
But you're right that burn was suspicious.
Very suspicious.
And it turned out it wasn't a carpet burn at all.
What was it?
It was a chemical burn from halothane.
Halothane.
It's an anesthetic.
So someone deliberately tried to cover up what happened to Tammy.
Yeah, and what we know now from this article is just horrifying.
Beyond disturbing.
Bernardo drugged and sexually assaulted Tammy.
And Karla, her own sister, was involved?
Not only involved, she participated in videotape the whole thing.
That is just...
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
I know.
That level of cruelty and deception is what makes this case so disturbing.
They staged the whole thing to look like an accident.
They cleaned everything up. They hid the videotape,
And it worked.
at least for a while.
It's unbelievable that they got away with that for so long.
It's crazy, right?
And then, as if Tammy's death wasn't horrific enough,
Right.
the nightmare continued
Yeah.
with the discovery of Leslie Mahafy's dismembered remains in Lake Gibson.
Yeah, that was just brutal.
The brutality of that discovery sent shockwaves through the whole community.
You can't even imagine the level of depravity involved in something like that.
And to add insult to injury, Bernardo and Homolka were on their honeymoon in Hawaii when this was all happening.
Honeymooning in Hawaii.
Can you imagine?
While investigators are trying to piece together what happened to Leslie,
It's just mind-blowing.
a carefree vacation while this horrible investigation is going on.
It's like they had no conscience whatsoever.
It's a chilling disconnect.
And here's the crazy thing. Right at this point, no one had connected her murder to the Scarborough rapist.
And Tammy's death was still being treated as an accident.
So they're dealing with two separate investigations,
Totally separate.
completely unaware that they're looking for the same people.
It's unbelievable how many pieces of the puzzle they were missing.
And you can see how that lack of communication and coordination really hindered the whole investigation.
Totally.
In fact, the FBI even got involved.
They did.
And their profiling suggested that the killer, whoever they thought was responsible for Tammy and Leslie's deaths, would probably strike again.
And tragically, they were right.
Less than a year later, Kristen French's body was found.
And the similarities to Leslie's murder were obvious.
It was a confirmation that the nightmare was far from over.
Yeah.
So the initial investigation into Kristen's disappearance focused on this witness account
Okay.
that described a cream-colored Camaro.
Right.
And that turned out to be a total red herring.
Completely wrong.
Bernardo actually drove a gold Nissan.
Oh, wow.
There were other missed opportunities, too.
Yeah.
Little details that seemed insignificant at the time,
Right.
but later turned out to be crucial. Like that torn map of Scarborough they found near where Kristen was abducted.
Oh, right.
That was the first real clue that linked this case back to the Scarborough rapist.
Wow.
But even with this new evidence, they still didn't immediately focus on Bernardo.
Really?
He was actually interviewed again and
Yeah.
dismissed as a prime suspect.
Wow. It just shows you how difficult it can be to catch someone like that.
Especially when he's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable how close they were to catching him so many times.
So many times.
Yet he managed to slip through the cracks.
I bet that was incredibly frustrating for the investigators.
I can't even imagine.
Well, remember, this was before DNA profiling was widely used.
True.
They were relying on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and good old-fashioned detective work.
But eventually things started to shift.
Okay.
The truth began to unravel.
And how did that happen?
And surprisingly, it was Karla Homolka herself who played a pivotal role in breaking the case wide open. Yeah, she ended up in the hospital after a particularly brutal beating by Bernardo.
Oh, wow.
This led to his arrest,
Okay.
but only for assault.
Right.
And he was released on bail, pending trial.
But that arrest proved to be a turning point.
A huge turning point.
How so?
Because while he was out on bail, that crucial DNA match finally came through.
That's right. The DNA match was a bombshell.
It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for.
They finally had concrete evidence linking Bernardo to the Scarborough rapist crimes.
The game was up.
But just when you think this story couldn't get any crazier, right?
Yeah.
It takes another turn.
Okay.
So faced with all this evidence against him, right, Karla Homolka, she decides to make a deal with the Crown.
A plea bargain.
Exactly.
So for those of us who aren't lawyers, can you break down what a plea bargain is?
Sure, yeah.
Especially in this context.
So basically it means the defendant agrees to plead guilty to some of the charges,
Okay.
often lesser ones,
Right.
in exchange for something from the prosecution.
Like a shorter sentence.
Yeah.
Exactly. Usually a reduced sentence.
Yeah.
So in Karla's case, she agreed to testify against Bernardo.
Okay.
And in exchange, she got a 12-year sentence for manslaughter.
12 years for manslaughter.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is, at the time,
Yeah.
public opinion was actually on Karla's side.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of people saw her as a victim, too.
Oh, wow.
This battered wife forced into participating in these horrible acts.
By this controlling, abusive husband?
Right, and people bought into that narrative.
Yeah, I can see how people would feel sympathy for her given that story.
I mean, it's a compelling story, right?
It is.
This vulnerable young woman caught in this horrific situation.
But then the truth came out.
And how'd that happen?
In a way no one could have predicted.
Those infamous videotapes.
The ones the police missed when they first searched Bernardo's house.
Yeah, how did those even surface?
It's a crazy story. Bernardo's lawyer somehow got a hold of them
What?
and then eventually turned them over to the authorities.
Wow.
So those tapes, they ended up being absolutely crucial in revealing what Karla was really involved in.
Because it showed everything.
In graphic detail.
Yeah, and it showed that she wasn't some reluctant participant forced into these acts.
Right.
She was an active and willing participant.
Even taking a dominant role sometimes.
It must have been devastating for the people who believed her story.
Oh, absolutely.
That battered wife image was totally shattered.
Public opinion did a complete 180.
And the plea bargain,
Yeah.
which seemed reasonable at the time.
Right, with the information they had.
Now it's being called a deal with the devil.
People felt betrayed.
It's hard to imagine the level of outrage people must have felt.
It was a major turning point in the case.
For sure. And those tapes had a huge impact on Bernardo's trial.
Right, because now there was no doubt about his guilt.
At all. He was convicted on all charges, first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault.
Wow.
And he got a life sentence and
Right.
was designated a dangerous offender.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so that means he's considered a high risk to reoffend
Okay.
and could be kept in prison indefinitely,
Even after serving his sentence?
even after serving his sentence.
Wow, that makes parole pretty unlikely.
Extremely unlikely.
So basically, Bernardo was locked away for good.
But the case didn't end there.
Right.
The public wanted answers. They
Right.
wanted to know how someone like Bernardo could have operated for so long without being caught,
Yeah.
and how the system failed so badly.
Yeah, there was a huge public outcry, a demand for accountability.
So that led to a major public inquiry into the whole police investigation.
And what did they find?
Well, they exposed a lot of missteps and missed opportunities.
Like what?
One of the biggest problems was a lack of communication and coordination between the different police agencies.
So they weren't sharing information.
Not effectively.
So they were operating in silos.
Yeah, basically.
And that allowed Bernardo to slip through the cracks.
For years.
Wow.
So even though they had some evidence and even interviewed Bernardo, it wasn't all coming together.
They weren't seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And there were other issues too.
Like what?
Like bureaucratic red tape
Oh, yeah.
and just a reluctance to admit mistakes.
The inquiry really shed light on how the system failed.
And allowed this tragedy to happen.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, and the inquiry resulted in a number of recommendations for reform.
Like what kind of reforms?
Aimed at improving communication between police agencies, streamlining investigations, and increasing awareness about predatory behavior.
So it wasn't just about catching the criminals.
Right.
It was about holding the system accountable.
And making sure something like this never happened again.
It's like the system itself was on trial.
Yeah, forced to confront its own shortcomings.
Powerful.
And while that doesn't bring back the victims,
Right.
it hopefully led to some positive changes that might prevent future tragedies.
I hope so.
The case really forced law enforcement agencies across Canada to rethink their procedures and prioritize collaboration. And what about Karla? What happened to her after the truth came out?
Well, she had already entered into that plea bargain.
Right.
So there wasn't much they could do legally.
So she served her 12 years?
Yeah. Her full sentence
Yeah.
and was released in 2005.
Even though the public knew she was much more involved than they originally thought,
Right.
she still walked free.
That had to be hard for the victims' families.
I can't even imagine.
To see her walk free after everything.
That just doesn't seem fair.
And to make matters worse, when she was released, she had all these conditions.
Okay, like what?
Restrictions on her movements, contact with minors.
Okay.
But just a few months later, another judge overturned those conditions.
So she was basically free to go rebuild her life.
Yeah, while the families of her victims were left to deal with this unimaginable pain.
That's just not right.
It was a very controversial decision.
Sparked a lot of outrage, I'm sure.
It raised a lot of questions about the purpose of punishment,
Yeah.
the possibility of rehabilitation, and whether some crimes are just too horrific to forgive.
It's hard to imagine what those families went through.
Knowing that the woman who played a part in their loved ones' deaths was out there living her life.
It's just not fair.
This case really highlights the limitations of the justice system.
It does.
It can punish,
But
it can't always heal or provide closure.
And for the families of the victims,
Yeah.
the pain and the search for justice continue.
Long after the trials are over.
This case had a profound impact on everyone involved.
Directly and indirectly.
It exposed the dark side of human nature, the vulnerabilities of our systems, and the enduring power of grief.
And the need for justice.
And the impact went far beyond the families and those directly involved in the case.
It sent shockwaves through all of Canada.
Yeah.
It shook people's faith in law enforcement, sparked debates about plea bargains.
It left a lingering sense of unease.
It definitely changed the way Canadians thought about crime and justice.
And the monsters that might be lurking right next door.
Hiding in plain sight. And you know what's interesting is that before this case, I think the public's image of a serial killer was kind of shaped by Hollywood, you know?
Oh, for sure.
Like some shadowy figure of loner, someone who stands out.
Right.
But Bernardo and Homolka, they completely shattered that stereotype.
Yeah, they were young, they were attractive.
Lived in a nice house.
Seemed normal.
Totally normal.
It's like the ultimate monster hiding in plain sight scenario.
Exactly. It made people realize that evil could exist anywhere.
Even in the most ordinary places.
Your seemingly average neighbor could be capable of horrific things.
It's a scary thought.
It really shook people up.
It did, and it highlighted how dangerous it can be to ignore those red flags.
Right.
Or to dismiss those seemingly minor details.
In this case, there were warning signs everywhere.
But they were overlooked or misinterpreted.
Exactly, and the consequences were devastating.
The article mentions that Homolka eventually settled in Quebec.
Oh, wow.
And even had children.
It's strange to think about life going on after something like that.
Yeah. I wonder what kind of shadow this case casts on her life now.
It's a question a lot of people have.
Right. Can someone who has committed such horrific acts ever truly be rehabilitated?
Can they ever escape their past?
It's a tough question.
It is. There are no easy answers.
And what about Bernardo?
He's still in prison, right?
Yeah, he's currently serving his life sentence at Millhaven Institution.
Which is a maximum security prison.
Yeah, he's applied for parole a few times.
Has he?
But he's been denied each time.
I'm not surprised given his dangerous offender status and the nature of his crimes.
Yeah, it's highly unlikely he'll ever be released.
It's probably for the best.
This case is just one of those things you can't shake off.
It's disturbing,
So many twists and turns.
and it leaves you with more questions than answers.
It really does.
I think that's why it continues to fascinate and horrify people even after all these years.
It's a stark reminder of the dark side of human nature
The flaws in our systems.
and the ripple effects of violence.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have the crimes, the investigation, the plea bargain, the aftermath.
But it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore.
The psychology of Bernardo and Homolka,
The impact on the victims' families.
the legal and ethical debates.
It's a deep rabbit hole for sure.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in digging deeper, there are books, documentaries, articles.
Endless material.
But be warned, it's not easy stuff.
No, it's a story that definitely stays with you.
But I think it's important to remember that while this case exposed the worst of humanity,
It did.
it also revealed incredible resilience
A first for justice.
and a determination to learn from these mistakes.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious how this case changed your perception of not only serial killers, but also the justice system's ability to handle these kinds of complex, high-profile cases. It's something to think about and maybe even do some more research on your own. This case was a turning point in Canadian history, and its impact is still felt today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka case.